Shall we do this?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
All of this is toxic, isn't it?
If you don't want me to answer questions,
okay,
journalists shouldn't ask them.
okay.
This is the most dramatic period in British politics in my lifetime. I mean, literally. Things are getting worse. I mean, things just don't get better anymore.
What role does that media play right now?
I always say, I think Rupert Murdoch's the most damaging immigrant that's ever come to this country. If all you've done is read the newspapers, all you know about me is I'm a corrupt, anti-Semitic, violent, alcoholic tax dodger, but fortunately I managed to win a couple of elections.
Thatcher.
The thing I respected about her was she believed in things and pushed them through. She didn't care whether people hated her. Cameron and Osborne and Boris Johnson, they have no understanding. They didn't really meet working class people until they went to Oxford and met their servants, It doesn't matter who wins the election, they just look after a small elite and line their own pockets.
Livingstone, the former mayor of London, is quite frankly not what you would expect. Because I think most of us grew up with a misrepresentation of Ken. We knew him as Red Ken. We had small media sound bites of all these crazy things that he was. And I, as a member of the media, even am subject to these, and I had the wrong impression of Ken because he's actually a fascinating man who spent his entire life doing public service for London, for the UK, and it really comes out in this interview. And what I like about Ken is he sat down and said, Brian, I'll answer any question you want. And he was very honest to say that while he hated Margaret Thatcher, he respected her because she was really about what she truly believed in. And much like many politicians today, not to mention any names, Boris, he thinks that they become celebrities, where they get caught up in their own fame and they forget why they're actually doing the work, which is to really serve the other people around them. He said it was the longest interview he's ever given in his life, and he truly enjoyed it. And I think I'll probably be spending more time with Ken. He might even be invited to Thanksgiving at my house. And so sit back, relax. He talks about how he snatched the London Olympics from Paris by getting the Russians to vote for him. And he's really a man that's been around everywhere, and he had a lot to say about the UK's current political climate with the change of prime ministers and all the posturing going on. He says it's the most exciting time in British politics is in his entire life. He also had a lot to say about Rupert Murdoch and the media, so I think you're really going to enjoy this time with Ken. So sit back, relax, and enjoy that. You know, it's been another crazy week here at London Real, especially in the Academy. We did a 60-second burpee challenge, and if you don't know what that is, it's a physical movement where you get on the ground and go up. And people from all over the world inside the Academy have posted hundreds of videos to see how many they could do, and I did the same. And this is all part of our 7-day body and mind challenges that we have on the inside. The idea is that little changes make a big difference over time, and so definitely get inside there and check it out. But now I'm going to leave you with Mr. Ken Livingstone.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Ken Livingstone, the English politician and former mayor of London from 2000 to 2008. You've been in politics for nearly 50 years, originally joining the Labour Party in 1968. Ken, welcome to London Real.
Hi, great.
Great to have you here. You know, there's so much to talk about today. It's probably been one of the most exciting 7-day periods in British politics. We were talking about that earlier. Of course, we'll get to Brexit, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, future of the Labour Party, Tories. We'll talk about your recent suspension. But before that, I would love to talk a little bit about your history. You know, you've been in politics for nearly 50 years. You've seen Vietnam War protests, troubles in Ireland, Thatcher, Blair. You were the mayor of London for 8 years. You've seen the formation of the European Union, now the Brexit. I was wondering if you could maybe just briefly walk us through maybe just kind of each decade and maybe one thing you remember and more importantly, how you see it affecting kind of where we are today. Because I think a lot of people don't understand that, you know, today's status quo is because of many things that happened in the past.
I think it's going because I was born in 1945. I grew up in a fairly austere post-war world. But I mean, I wasn't interested in politics at all. I fell in love with science. By the time I was 11, I was interested in astronomy. Then by the time I was 12, it was collecting newts and frogs and toads. When I left school, because I mean, only about one kid in 20 went to uni in those days, I applied for a job at London Zoo, but they didn't have any vacancies. And I just had no interest in politics. I mean, it was only, I was 18, coming home on a Friday night, plonked down in front of the television with me dinner, and the news comes on that President Kennedy's been assassinated. And for my generation, we spent the whole weekend glued. I mean, we were all having our Sunday dinner when we actually saw Lee Harvey Oswald shot live on television. I mean, wow. And so suddenly I started reading about American politics. And of course, American politics is much more glamorous than ours and so on. And I got more and more interested in it. But I didn't join the Labour Party until, about another 5 years. Because I have to say, like the generation that feel betrayed by Tony Blair, I was 19 when Harold Wilson became Prime Minister. I remember thinking, well, I don't need to join the Labour Party. He'll have sorted out all the problems of poverty within the next 5 years and so on. And of course, you get let down. I suppose if I look at those decades, once I joined, I fell in love with it. I was on the local council. And in those days, a council was free to do anything that wasn't illegal. Now it's all run from Whitehall, but we got elected in 1971 in Lambeth, and with a promise to give free contraception away. Wow. And that was just depicted as, you were trying to undermine Christian civilization and so on. And we introduced free travel for pensioners on the Underground. Now local government, everything's regulated and controlled from the centre. And I had no intention of being MP. I thought I want to spend the rest of my life in local government, because I could, you could get a wonderful adventure playground built on the estate I grew up on and things like that. And then along came the oil crisis in '73. Government started cutting back. I got caught up in being pushed forward as a candidate. I remember it was the first election I lost, standing in Hampstead the year Mrs. Thatcher got in. And then I ended up, of course, becoming the leader of the GLC. And that, I was overwhelmed by it, because the Greater London Council, no one paid much attention to it. And most probably only about one person in 20 could even have told you the leader of it was. And suddenly I get elected with my politics. There's this wall of media hysteria, like Jeremy Corbyn.
Your politics are liberal politics.
Well, to the left of liberal. I'm a genuine socialist. So I'm elected saying we must stop discriminating against homosexuals, we must have equal rights for women, we should negotiate with the IRA, and the world just went mad.
And you were always feeling that way? Were you brought up in a household that encouraged that thinking?
Well, I was lucky. I was the first person in this working class household. My dad was a window cleaner, my mum a shop worker. She had been a dancer on the stage in the 30s. So she'd grown up in a world where she knew homosexuals was no problem. My dad had been in the Merchant Navy for about 15 years, met people from all the way around, so he wasn't racist. So I grew up in a household without any sex. They were an equal couple as well, which wasn't usual in the 50s. So I grew up without any of the bias of racism or homophobia or anything like that. And so I thought these were issues you should take up. Because back in the early 80s, if someone was exposed as homosexual, he had to retire from public life. And even, I mean, I can think of, somebody like Dusty Springfield. She had to live her whole life keeping her sexuality totally private because it had been the end of her career. Now, of course, you've got a Tory Prime Minister allowing gay marriage, inconceivable 30 years ago. So the whole world has been transformed. The only real regret I have is that I grew up in that world where things always got better. I mean, I left school, every boy got a job. I didn't know an unemployed person till I was about 28 or 29. And you look at my children's generation and my grandchildren's, things are getting worse. I mean, things just don't get better anymore. I grew up just assuming, life would always be comfortable and easy. Now we've had 35 years really where things have got much tougher.
You mentioned the 80s, Thatcher coming in. What happened to you then? You went into the GLC then?
Yeah.
And that was the Greater London Council, so it was you controlled as large.
Oh yeah, I mean it was the largest local authority, I think, in Western Europe.
Okay.
Not quite as much power as the Mayor of New York's got and so on, but I mean we were elected to tackle bigotry in different kinds, but to cut the fares, to get people out their cars and into public transport, to build more council homes, just focus on doing things. And I never expected to become a nationally known figure. And the wave of the Daily Mail depicted me as a sort of pro-IRA terrorist, Soviet agent.
Red Ken.
Yes, Red Ken.
Is that when that came out?
Which I was attacked on the streets about 3 times.
Physically?
Physically. My poll rating went down to just 18% in 3 months. But slowly people would see me on interviews like this and things like that, and it turned round. And after about 2 or 3 years, I was runner-up to the Pope in the BBC's Man of the Year poll. I mean, it's a transformation.
Because why do you think people change their mind about you?
Well, I was depicted as some sort of anti-British monster. And when people could see me on TV, they thought, no, I mean, he's actually just a fairly normal guy. I remember the very first national thing I did was the radio programme Any Questions in early '82. And that's the first time it'd been a nationwide audience rather than just London. And the following week, I mean, the guy who presented it, David Jacobs, read out all the letters. Then all the letters came in saying, we're surprised he was such a reasonable guy. And we didn't have a single hostile letter. And so from then on, I just focused on trying to get onto national radio and TV, because the Daily Mail was never going to be nice about me, whatever I did. And I mean, we only discovered it years later, but the Daily Mail and the Telegraph met with Thatcher's, campaign team in about early '82 or mid '82, after the Falklands War, and there was a general election coming up. And the strategy they decided was that Tony Benn, Arthur Scargill, the miners' leader, and myself should be depicted as the enemy within, a threat to British democracy. And Tory Central Office were going around telling journalists that I'd been at a gay party where I'd been sodomised by 6 men in succession. The following year, no paper took that up. I could have made a fortune in the libel courts, but the following year they're going around saying Special Branch has got a file on his activities with schoolgirls. So it's a really dirty old...
So really dirty, really conspiracy.
And people see what's happening now and think, hasn't politics got nasty? It's always been nasty.
And the Daily Mail and the other paper, why would they conspire with the Tories? Was that in their interest? Were they funded by them?
Yeah, I mean, the Daily Mail has always worked for the right. I mean, I always remind people, 1906, the Daily Mail headline was Jews bring crime and disease to Britain. Then it was the Irish, then it was the Caribbeans, currently it's the Muslims and so on. The Daily Mail and a lot of the other papers have always stoked that fear that, migrants are going to ruin our way of life. If you think of the contribution Jews made to Britain and the dynamism they brought to our economy, I mean, exactly the same as today. I mean, 2/3 of the immigrants who come here come with a degree.
Which is twice the number of the people in Britain.
Yeah.
It's a staggering statistic. Well, Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
But he was wrong. History always repeats itself. I mean, when I was the leader of the GLC, we only had a majority of 4 out of 92. And so and there was at least 8 members of the Labour group wanted me dead, so there was always rebellions and things. And the Tories would demand a special meeting to discuss something I was vulnerable on. And I realised, we'd have the meeting on Friday afternoon, because about 4 members of the Tory group would go back to their country estate, so I'd always win. And then a couple of years later, I'm reading Suetonius' History of the 12 Caesars, which he wrote about 2,000 years ago. And I said, Julius Caesar did exactly the same thing. When the Conservatives in the Senate wanted a special meeting, he called it on Friday afternoon. All the really rich ones had gone back to their country estates. And I mean, if Thatcher and Reagan had really studied the history of the Great Depression, they would have never have made the mistakes that led to the banking crisis in 2008.
Really?
Yeah.
And those seeds were planted in the 80s, is what you're saying?
Well, after the banking crisis, America had the Glass-Steagall Act, which really introduced tight regulation of banks. They couldn't take all these dodgy risks again. And then we hit the 1980s, and Reagan's under pressure to reduce the regulation. When Bill Clinton came in, he finally repealed Glass-Steagall. What did the banks do? They started taking lots of dodgy risks again, And what's worrying is we haven't, both in Britain and America, we haven't brought back that tight regulation. So you could get another banking crisis,
You mentioned this kind of cyclical demonization of immigrants. You said and it was, what was it, the Irish and then the West Indians, and you see this continuing to repeat itself?
Well, since the vote to leave the EU last week, we've had a real upsurge of people screaming at Poles or Muslims and so on. That compared with a lot of the rest of the Western world, it's not as bad here in London as it is in a lot of other places. I remember I think we've done better at integrating people. If I'd come home with a black girlfriend 50 years ago, the whole street would have talked about it. My granddaughter is mixed race. No one registers it here in this city. And so there's so many people, mixed marriages between races and religions. I think we're a fairly good example for the rest of the world.
Let me walk you through a few decades here and then we can talk about current events. Thatcher. Did you watch the movie about her, by the way? It came out a few years ago. It kind of covered some of her dementia.
No, I didn't. I must have missed it. I didn't even know there had been one.
When you remember the Thatcher years, how do you feel about it? When she died, there were certain people that celebrated, there were certain people that did not. Well, how do you remember?
She abolished the Greater London Council I was running, so I thought that was profoundly the people in London elect an administration you don't like, you abolish their right to have that. That was pretty horrendous. And I think almost all of her policies, in hindsight, turned out to be wrong. But the thing I respected about her was she believed in things and pushed them through. She didn't care whether people hated her. She was really, a friend of mine who's a Tory minister in her government, David Mellor, says actually, dealing with Saddam Hussein was nicer than having to deal with Mrs. Thatcher. She was brutal and rude, but she believed in things and drove it through. And so many politicians today, they just seem to want to be there. They don't really have an agenda. She thought she could change Britain for the best. She drove it all through. I think she failed in that. But at least she believed in something. She didn't care about lining her own pockets or, being a celebrity or something.
Right, and we see a lot of that today.
Oh, God.
Well, we'll get into some of the celebrity politicians shortly. The 90s. I think I arrived here in this country July 5th, 1997, which I think was Mr. Blair came in.
Yeah.
How do you remember the new Labour government, the Blair, everything?
Well, see, in that election, a lot of people now say, only Tony Blair could have won. The truth was, we'd had 18 years of the Tories, it had become a real mess, and people were going to throw out the Tories. Whether we'd had previous leaders like Neil Kinnock or Johnson, or even the proverbial pig's bladder on a stick, we would have won that election. And Tony Blair was a nice guy. I had a chat with him about 10 weeks before the election, sounding out each other, would he give me a job and so on. And I came away thinking, oh my God, you're so not ready for this, And he'd never chaired a council committee, he'd never run anything in his life. A bit like Obama. Obama had been a social worker, he'd been a lawyer. So the first thing you get to run is the whole country. This is a steep learning curve. But the other thing about that, he'd moved the party to the right, but I didn't believe he actually believed all this rubbish he was coming out with. I assumed he'd get in and then be a good bit more radical. But no, he did seem to believe it. And basically, I look back on that 13 years of the Blair-Brown administration as they did some good little things. He finally brought peace to Northern Ireland. They allowed gay partnerships and so on. But he didn't tackle the big problems about getting better jobs for people. Our manufacturing continued to be wiped out. He didn't build council houses that people could afford to rent. And that's why so much anger. I mean, the sort of anger that's helped Donald Trump get the Republican nomination and helped Jeremy Corbyn get the Labour seat here. There's an awful lot of people just saying they know what life their parents had and it was better than they've got now. And they're right to be angry.
Mayor of London, did you ever foresee yourself having that role in the 80s? I know the job didn't exist,
Yeah.
But when you started hearing the talk about this role happening, was that an obvious fit for you?
Well, I mean, I was opposed to having a mayor for London. I was saying we should have a council. Don't put all the power in one person's hands. But Tony Blair was in love with everything American, so he brought the American mayoral system in. And I always say, well, look, at any one time, there's always at least 50 ex-mayors in America in prison for fraud and corruption. And you just have to think about this. If all the power rests with the mayor, when the developer who wanted to build the Shard came to see me to ask for planning permission, I could have said, of course, I just want $500,000 in this numbered Swiss bank account, you know.
You can't do that these days.
You can do that. And eventually we'll have a mayor that does.
We don't have one that just did, do we?
No, well, no. Boris was so keen to be Prime Minister, he never did anything corrupt. But one day we'll get one that does do that. It happens all the time in America.
Just because too much power in one person.
Yeah, I mean, you could call the post the Mayor of London, but if you had a council and they could remove the mayor if they were doing wrong or being a bit dodgy or something like that, but you could get away with murder.
Does the Mayor of London have more unchecked power than the Prime Minister?
Well, no, you see, the Prime Minister, as we've just seen, can be removed. You're elected for 4 years. And I mean, it was the guy in Toronto who got dodgy problems with drugs and all that. I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But unless it's something spectacular like that, the most mediocre and dodgy mayor will carry on to the end of their term.
One of my friends and next door neighbors is Max Kaiser of the Kaiser Report, and he overlooks the mayor's office, and he said, Brian, and he's in the same building as London and Partners, and he said, Brian, there's just a line of people that line up in front of that office, and they all go in looking for influence. And he's just, I watch it every day, and I sometimes take it with a grain of salt, but there's a lot
The other thing is, when I was the leader of the GLC, there were 92 people there. They all brought different ideas. I mean, if it's all just the mayor, you've got a little coterie of advisors that come up with things. So it's not as open to new ideas and thinking as a council or a parliament is. I mean, I think the weakness of the American system is, it looks like the president has all those powers, but then the Congress usually ends up being run by a rival party and nothing much happens. And it's almost as though the people that created the American Constitution wanted to create a government that wouldn't do anything, They wanted small government. They got one that just doesn't work.
Now, to become Mayor of London, you had to leave the Labour Party to do that. Why did that happen?
Well, as I wanted to stay as an MP and focus on the government's economic policy because I didn't think it was working. But there was this huge public pressure sort of suddenly built up, and I became, the people's choice. And I couldn't walk down the street without people saying, you've got to run, you've got to run. And then Tony Blair, originally he was being told by people like Alistair Campbell, just don't let him stand, But there was huge, it was all at the front page of the papers, they're trying to rig this and the election. And so they came up with a system in which the membership had a third of the vote, the unions had a third of the vote, and the London MPs had a third of the vote. Now that was, there's about 50 London MPs, but 80,000 Labour Party members in London, they're equal. So when you added up all the individual votes cast, I'd got 74,000, Blair's candidate got 24,000, but he was the winner because the votes of the MPs were worth 1,000 times the votes of an ordinary member. So I thought, well, bugger that, this is just wrong. And people were so put out by it as well, that we wouldn't have won. Labour would have lost, the Tories would have won. And so I had to stand.
Did you have a working relationship with Tony Blair at this point?
Well, No, because I suppose it's my fault. After he'd been Prime Minister for about 3 months, he asked to see me, and he was clearly sounding me out for a job again. And I just said, well, I don't see any point in being in your government, because no one's allowed to do anything. It's all run by you and Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell at the centre. And we had a harsh exchange and all of that, and he didn't give me a job. Most likely wouldn't have took it. But then we hit this point where I'd won, and he gave me a nice phone call the next morning. But they kept me at arm's length because they did genuinely believe that when I introduced the congestion charge to charge cars coming into the city, it would be a disaster, it wouldn't work. And so, I mean, for 2.5 years they kept me out of the party. And then it came in, it worked perfectly, and a couple of months later, Tony Blair said, would you come back and be our candidate, please? And I said, yes. That's exactly the exchange, one sentence and a one-word answer.
So in 2004, when you were re-elected as the Labour
candidate.
Okay.
Right.
I remember the congestion charge. I came back to London in 2002, and I remember it kind of happening. I didn't have a car, but my friends did. When you look back on both of your terms as mayor, what are the things you remember most of accomplishing? Is the congestion charge one?
The congestion charge, I mean, people saw it as a mega thing, but it was just trying to reduce, I mean, traffic speed was down to about 9 miles an hour in central London. And even with the congestion charge, it only went up to about 12.5. I mean, it's back down to about 9 now, because we've got a lot more people in London. But the big thing was actually, as well as trying to discourage people driving, was to get people into public transport. And when I became mayor, we had 5,500 clapped out old buses. We got 8,000 new ones, new routes. We froze the bus fares. And I think it's about twice as many people use the buses now as did then. And my successor carried on that policy. And then we started building extensions on the underground, tram extensions. We took over the worst railway in London, what used to be called the North London Line. Now it's the London Overground. We spent £1.5 billion doing it up, new trains, I mean, much more regular service. So there's been a huge shift into public transport. And given the impact of cars on air pollution and the number of people that are killed by that, thank God we did.
Why are you always such a proponent for public transport?
Well, I suppose I've lived all my life in London. I mean, I've never learned to drive. What is the point, If I get a cab after doing this interview to go home, it'll take twice as long as if I just walk to the old street tube and get the tube.
Congestion charge, one of them. Other crowning achievements when you think about your mayoral terms. We were talking about the Olympics earlier.
Well, the Olympics was great fun, and the legacy, because what I've learned about economics is that the biggest single factor in a country's success is investment. And there's the investment that the state should do, like, good transport system, build houses people can afford to live in. We should now be actually having a good broadband system. I mean, when I'm in the Far East, I can access the internet in about 1/10 the time it takes here. We need a good fibre optic cable system, all of that. If the state does that, then private businesses will come see a city or a region that's working, and they will invest. And it's that relationship between public and private investment. And so, when I got elected, we started to get lots of investment to transform our transport system. But virtually in the first few weeks, the British Olympic Association came to me and said, we want to bid for the Olympics. We can only do it with your sport. And I said, well, I've been to one sporting event in my life, cricket match at the Oval, and I fell asleep. I have no interest in sport. But if we say the site will be in the East End on that most polluted and rundown area, we'll throw everything into winning this. And everyone can say, well, it cost $8 billion, but it transformed. I mean, area is so polluted that we had to remove about 12 feet of soil that was so contaminated. I mean, all that was going on there was dodgy, cars that were stolen and broken up and things like that, prostitution. No one wandered around that area at night.
Stratford.
Yeah, now it's transformed. And I mean, that borough is growing more strongly than any other. And when I look at, the way so many people in the north of England and the regions that have been left behind voted to leave Europe, I have to say, it's not because we're in Europe, it's because you haven't got the sort of investment I was able to get for London. And we need to, I'm really proud of the investment we got for London. I just regret, I was never Prime Minister. I wanted investment all over the country, not just in London. That's why so many people outside come to hate London. They just, it gets everything. But they haven't got the politicians there making the case for, you know, what you want is a high-speed rail link from Liverpool through Manchester over to Hull. Areas that have been really left behind, able to get around quickly.
Do you think high-speed travel would be maybe the most intelligent investment for this country to make, to just bring it all together?
It's travel, but also a good broadband system. I mean, back in 1983, my GLC, we sent a proposal to Thatcher saying, your government, because then BT was a public organisation, British Telecoms, your government should create a fibre optic cable system linking every home and business in Britain. We think if you do that, you'll create 400,000 new jobs. An underestimate now, given as we see it.
This is what year you wrote this?
1983.
83.
She didn't even reply. And then 5 years later, I was on Labour's National Executive and I was saying, this should be a commitment to do this in our 92 election manifesto. Gordon Brown voted against it. A year later, I was off the NEC and it was just died. It never happened. And now we're so far behind many of our rivals. So it's good public transport, because also, I mean, it sounds a bit, you know, geeky this, but I mean, I used to take about 40 minutes to get to work on the tube or the bus. I could read, as opposed to sitting behind a wheel. That's 4 working weeks a year. It actually is a brilliant idea to actually get out your car and use your time usefully.
Looking back at Mayor, Olympics, big on your list, that all happened. Were you happy the way everything went down? I remember when you beat Paris to get that bid. It was a big thing.
It was been brilliant, because still today you're getting more construction there, new firms are coming, homes are being built. There's still most likely 20 years of development to come as that whole area is transformed. It's worked even better than I hoped it would, actually. And you've got these amazing venues that are still there. I mean, people go there just to walk around and see them, you know, they are stunning.
Yeah, I would have never gone to Stratford before that. Biggest frustration or challenge you had as mayor over those 8 years? I wish I could have been able to do X, or what was it?
Well, I suppose the biggest frustration is, I mean, the mayor had limited powers, and most of what I achieved by working with business or the trade unions, not things I could order, but you brought coalition. We got a 20-year programme for London's economy that business and the unions all signed up to. But what haunts me is that I'd persuaded the Labour government under Tony Blair to allow the mayor to start building housing for rent, which we hadn't done for 30 years. And Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, and he said, well, once this power kicks in 2008, we'll give you £5 billion to start building them. And of course I lost the election, so it never happened. And also, we just introduced a low emission zone just before I lost. And you know, Boris didn't continue doing that. And now we've got 9,500 people die every year because our air quality is so bad. And the new mayor, I think, will move on that fairly quickly, but we just wasted so I think every politician who loses an election thinks, I mean, not just how annoyed they are they've lost, but they can't do the things that they were planning to do, and you just see people continuing to suffer.
Talking about your relationship with Boris Johnson, did you have a relationship before that 2008 election? And now how do you recall it now?
No, I mean the only thing is, I was really rude to a journalist once. There was a big campaign demanding I should apologise. And I just remember reading Boris's thing saying, Mr. Mayor, don't apologise, don't give in. But that was about the only thing where we've been on the same side. And I mean, we never had any social gathering at all, except just after the Olympics. I'd been retired by then, and he defeated me for re-election. He said, I'd like to take you out to dinner to my local Turkish restaurant. And I thought, that's brilliant. I'll spend all evening telling him you've got to start building homes for rent, which I did. But all he was interested in, all evening kept saying to me, why is it you failed to become Prime Minister? What were the mistakes you made? And when I said to him, we should build homes for rent, he said, homes for rent? Like I said, can I sleep with your wife? He was so shocked, and he just realised this little elite from the Bullingdon Club and Eton, they have no idea how difficult it is to get a home. You know, their parents give them one or something.
So there couldn't be any more polar opposites than Boris, the Eton grad rugby player, versus you growing up in the home of working class parents.
Well, I mean, this is what was interesting, that the election where we've now had Sadiq Khan elected was exactly the same sort of thing. He was a working class boy from a council estate in Tooting who'd worked his way up against, you know, a billionaire Zach Goldsmith who, you know, fortunately, I mean, Zach is a very nice, pleasant guy, but the campaign was really unpleasant and Islamophobic and all that. But you know, I think it says a lot about London that they elected a Muslim mayor at the height of all this Islamophobia and fear of terrorism and so on. That sends a very, very good sign to Muslims.
Yeah, I want to talk about the future of London and the mayor shortly. So, 2008, defeated by Boris, you had that Turkish dinner with him 4 years later in 12. That period where Boris was mayor, good things, bad things. I've been told that the Boris bikes should really be the Livingstone bikes because you had engineered that, but good and bad things that he did.
When he got in, a lot of my projects were underway, like doing up the London Overground, and he couldn't stop them, and so they carried on. But of all the projects I had underway, he stopped every single one except the bike scheme, which I'd copied from Paris. But then towards the end of his term, some of the schemes, like the separate cycle lanes, which he spiked when he got in, he realised painting blue lines on the street doesn't actually make it any safer, and the death toll continues, so he's reinstated some of those. But I think, and it's most probably why Boris has stood down from running for Prime Minister, was because he hasn't got a political agenda. He's seen as this, you know, lovable old Tory, and he's the most popular politician in Britain. But he had 8 years in office, and the only things which were uniquely his were the cable car to nowhere, which makes a huge loss, and the helter-skelter in the Olympic site, which also makes a big loss. And I think the reason he's dropped out of the race for Prime Minister is because an awful lot of Tory MPs don't seriously believe he'd do anything if he was in the job. And he couldn't guarantee to get enough votes to get into the final two places where the membership have the ballot.
And when you're complimenting Margaret Thatcher earlier about the fact that she at least had will, that was a slight jab at Boris by saying at least she had the will to push through policies he believed were right.
Whereas with Boris, I think he should have gone to show business. It is about celebrity, you know. Whereas Michael Gove, who's pushed him aside, he has a really scary right-wing agenda. I mean, makes Mrs. Thatcher look human.
So maybe in this case you kind of wish Boris would have stayed.
No, because I think it would be easier for Jeremy to defeat Michael Gove than it would be to defeat Boris, because Boris would just be like he was in the two elections I lost to him, you know, loads of jokes, humorous stuff and all that. No serious politics.
I had George Galloway in here about 3 years ago on my first Politician, and he said, Brian, politics is show business for ugly people.
Yes.
And then he said cheekily, but what would I know about that? Do you agree with him?
Well, when I came into politics back in the 60s, it was not about being good looking or charming. It was all filled with nerdy people interested in policies, you know. Now we've gone down the American route. It's so much about celebrity and the individual.
Did that start with Blair? With the
I think it's really Blair. Brought that. He dragged us down to the American level.
I take that as a compliment, being from America. Big announcement today, Boris not running for Prime Minister. Did you see that coming?
No, because, as I say, he took me out for that meal. All he talked about was how to become Prime Minister. I think from the moment he was a teenager, he's been, I want to be Prime Minister, I want that status, that position. And it's, I think, the fact he knows he's going to be defeated, and so he stepped back. It must be, I should imagine having a really sad evening tonight.
Do you think
his wife will have to put him on suicide watch?
Do you think to be continued?
He might come, he'll clearly be given a job in the government, whether it's Theresa May or Gove, but and he might come back and have another shot at it when they stand down or they lose the election. But he's very. I would like to have a chat with him tonight, because I suspect he'd be more open and honest about what he really feels than he's ever been before with
Maybe
me.
You can take him to your Turkish local. You can have a real chat. With Boris, it's probably a good time to jump into Brexit. When you try to take a bird's eye view of everything that's happened in the last 7 days and even the last 6 months, and maybe that relates to the last 30 years, and you see Boris and kind of his agenda, did he overplay his hand? Did he go a little bit too far on that power play to make that move as Prime Minister? And then your thoughts in general on the Brexit vote.
I don't have the slightest doubt that Boris is in favour of staying in. He's not an idiot. He knows that it'll be damaging to the economy. But I think he thought putting himself at the front of the exit campaign would line up all the rank and file of the Tory party behind him, guarantee that I think his assumption was there'd be a narrow victory for staying in. Cameron go in a year or two, Boris would ease into his place. And that's, I think, why Gove has pushed him aside. Gove knows Boris won't really negotiate a good exit deal.
Because he doesn't like the details.
He doesn't like the detail, but also, Gove actually wants really out. He doesn't want to stay in the single market. He wants us to be a completely separate little nation. And I suspect, in his heart of hearts, he'd like us to be the 51st state of America.
Before we go back into Brexit, can you talk about this special relationship between the US and the UK, how you feel about it, how it changed in the Blair years, and then the comment you just made?
See, I grew up in the Cold War, and I believed what we were being told, that there was this huge Soviet threat. The first American election I remember is Kennedy winning in '60, and that was all about Kennedy saying the Russians have overtaken us, they've got more nuclear weapons, all of that. What we now know is that when he was being briefed, having become president, he was told that America's got 400 missiles capable of reaching Russia. They have 4 capable of reaching America. America has 10 times the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union. It was only 15 years later, in the mid-70s, that the Soviet Union finally caught up. And basically, I think, I didn't start out as a conspiracy theorist, but I've become one. The military-industrial complex, I just wanted the Cold War. It created vast wealth. And oddly enough, Eisenhower, a Republican president, who went along with all of that, half of all federal government spending was on the military. But in his final message to the American people, just before he left office, he warned about the growing power of this military-industrial complex. And it's still there today. And we're about to spend £40 billion on 4 nuclear submarines we'll never use. But we've got the smallest army since Waterloo and Napoleon. We've got 2 aircraft carriers coming along which haven't got any planes on. Our military is its weakest it's ever been, and all the money's going on for nuclear subs we won't ever use. It's madness. But it's a bit like the plan to build this massive new Hinkley Point nuclear power station, coming at 25 billion. We'd just be better to give everybody enough money to put solar panels on their roof.
And what about the relationship with the US? Is it not even more important now if we leave the European Union?
Well, if we leave the European Union, I think we'll end up basically sucked into the American orbit on a grand scale.
Which is bad.
It is bad because, all the American interventions, there's a brilliant series, I don't think it's ever been shown on TV in Britain, but you can get it on DVDs, Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, that actually just depicts the Cold War was driven by America's economic interests. And the bizarre thing, Vietnam, which is most likely the most horrific war America's been involved in my lifetime. On the day the Japanese surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, approached the American president to say, we'd like your help to create a proper independent Vietnam. Because for 1,000 years, Vietnam had been in conflict with China. The idea that it was just going to be a red Chinese puppet was nonsense. And you have to ask, didn't State Department officials realise these were 2 nations at loggerheads? I know we had 30 years of war, at least 3.5 million Vietnamese killed. still today, the chemical bombing that was done is seeing children being born with horrendous deformities. And then you look at all our interventions in the Middle East, invading, overthrowing the government in Iran back in '53, invading, Iraq and Afghanistan. We would have been better just to let the Arabs sell us their oil at a reasonable price. The cost of these wars has been horrendous. And is the Middle East any better? Terrorism's a growing threat. Britain was awful, its empire ruined nations around the world, and America's sort of unofficial empire has done the same. Let countries run themselves.
It's a great documentary called The Fog of War, where they interviewed Robert McNamara, which is JFK's Secretary of Defense, and he talks about having a conversation with one of the North Vietnamese army generals after the conflict, and they sat down and had a few drinks, and they were both equally convinced that they were both completely opposite in their interests, as in the Vietnamese said, there's no way you could have think that we would have been with the Chinese, and McNamara's like, of course we did. And they were just back and forth in this fascinating
People should read history.
Yeah, there should be more history.
I bet no American politician knew the history of conflicts in Vietnam and China over 1,000 years.
Probably not. Brexit, when you take a look back, I know you've had a week now to kind of digest it. What do you see that maybe we're not talking about in the news? I mean, a lot of people have talked about how it was, these non-city voters that were voting, whether it was Sunderland at 70%, and some say it was an anti-politician, an anti-business, an anti-status quo vote. What do you see?
I think it is this anger, because, London voted to stay and it's done very well economically. There are still problems, but it's boomed. But so much of Britain's been left behind. Under Thatcher and Blair, we went from 7,000 jobs in manufacturing down to 7 million, down to 2 million. Those were good jobs that working class people had. It meant they could afford to buy a home or at least rent a good one. All that's been wiped out. What we've got now is 0 hours contracts, people, doing a little bit of mini cabbing just to make ends meet and things like that. And I think it was a sense of anger. Now, the Brexit campaign turned it all on. Immigrants have come here and taken our jobs and our homes. No, it isn't. For 35 years, our governments didn't create a good balanced economy with good jobs or build homes that people can afford to rent.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
And so I'm often more offensive than many other politicians. I still suspect, my phone's being bugged or my emails are being tapped into. But then I never do anything in private that I don't also do in public.